we will turn to our next question from WMAR's Kelly Swoop, and we'll go back to the number one position to be started by Mr. Ross. Kelly.
We talked about schools, we talked about transportation, we talked about crime, we talked about corruption, small business. If elected governor, Mr. Ross, what would be your number one top priority?
My number one top priority will be our schools. Look, I'm a former sixth grade teacher in Baltimore. I married the math teacher across the hall who's now in her third decade of teaching. I've got 3 kids in our city schools. I think that while no one thing is entirely deterministic of future well-being, the thing that comes the closest is education. And so when I wake up in the morning in the governor's mansion, the first thing that I'll be thinking of is how can we make sure that Maryland has world-class education?
Thanks, Mr. Ross. Mr. Jealous.
We have to make sure that all of us have the opportunity to succeed. That means that we must fully fund education. It also means that we must make sure that all of us have health care. I'm the only candidate up here with a plan for state-based single-payer, state-based Medicare for all. Finally, we'll be able to take on all of the pharmaceutical companies and get us a better deal. Finally, we'll be able to cut the cost of managing the system so we can stretch our health dollars further. Finally, we'll be able to build on our all-payer system and save even more dollars for our state.
Thank you, Mr. Jealous.
It's time for us to move forward.
Ms. Irvin, your number one priority if you are elected governor.
I think that's a very tough question, but my response to that would be I would focus on universal pre-K services for all Maryland families. And to my left is the great senator from my county, Rich Madaleno, who knows we have worked for many years on making sure that all of Maryland 3- and 4-year-olds have access to universal pre-K services, which is really going to help all the children that are starting from a position less than, and that should not be the case. So I want to focus on that as my number one priority.
Senator Madaleno.
Thank you, Valerie, and I enjoyed our years of working together to improve the schools of the state of Maryland. Look, when I walked into kindergarten in Montgomery County, my parents were worried I would never speak because I had a speech impediment. Thankfully, I went to school in a community that had the resources and the will to give me the therapy in classroom for 4 years in order to help me speak. I wouldn't be here today without that opportunity. My goal as your governor is to make sure the children of today and tomorrow have that same opportunity. That means investing in those additional services to overcome barriers.
Mr. Jones.
As your governor, I want to make sure that Maryland, when we all talk about making Maryland great again, but Maryland needs to be safe again. We need to make Maryland safe. I don't care what you put in place. If people are not comfortable, if they're not safe, then, we're wasting our time. And I want to do that by putting in place a public service employment program for felons. I want to get all of the felons off of the streets. Complacency is the biggest problem that we have, and that's why we have so much crime.
Thank you, Mr. Jones. Ms. Vignarajah, your number one priority if elected.
Education is far and away my top priority. It is how I got a chance to go from Woodlawn to the White House, and I want to make sure that every child has that opportunity. But I also want to take this time to just note the environment, because this is where Maryland is subject to being more vulnerable to climate change, to having the highest number of deaths due to air pollution, to having to address the Chesapeake Bay. So what I will also focus on as governor is investing in clean energy, making sure that we invest in offshore wind, solar, geothermal, as well as energy efficiency, but also restore the Chesapeake Bay by investing in wetlands and forests and oysters.
Mr. Jaffe, your top priority.
First thing I would do is create a 7-person panel. I would give them instructions. I'm going to give you 1 month to come up with recommendations which will make our state better. And I will say to them, these recommendations must not require any passage by the state legislature or the governor. I want to get all the politicians out of this, 7 respectable people with 5 good recommendations, which will go into effect immediately when you come to my office.
Thanks, Mr. Jaffe. Mr. Baker.
It's creating a great public school system. As I said in the beginning, I know this personally. Having stayed back when I was young in the 2nd grade, it was because of dedicated teachers who helped me out and allowed me to go on to college, go on to law school, and be able to sit on this and stand on this stage today. We have to make sure that every child in our state has that same opportunity, not just some, not because of your zip code or where you live, but every child. And that's the first thing we have to get done as a state.
Thanks, Mr. Baker. Mr. Shea.
Because of its enormous return on investment, raising revenues and cutting costs, education is my highest priority. But there are two important prerequisites to that. We need a robust economy in order to fund that. And by that I mean an expansive and inclusive economic growth. And secondly, we need safe communities. Without that, the education system can't thrive. I might just make one point on the single-payer system, if I could.
We're going to have to cut you off there because your time is up, but I have a rebuttal from Ms. Vignaraja, who still has one remaining. And unfortunately, Mr. Shea, you've used all yours at this time. Ms. Vignaraja.
Obviously, I've talked about topics, but I also want to talk about what my top priority is in terms of approach. Because maybe this is the mom in me, but we need to do more investing in an ounce of prevention rather than a pound of cure. Politicians often talk about stormwater management only after the latest flood. We only talk about preventing gun violence only after the latest mass shooting or skyrocketing crime. We only talk about sexual harassment after Hollywood headlines and the Annapolis frat culture have been exposed.
Ms. Vignaraja, that's all the time we have there. Thank you very much for that